Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Once again, we will be exploring true horror stories taken directly from various Reddit pages. For those who are new to the channel, I will be adding software to my voice to make it a little scarier, so don't be confused when I sound a little different. If you guys enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe, it really does help the channel grow. Without further ado, let's get started.
I killed my best friend last week. Now he's acting like nothing happened. He's dead. I thought, finally realizing, stood over his body. What am I going to do? And truth was, I had no idea. Murder was a serious charge. I'd watched those true crime documentaries. I knew how this worked. The killer always gets caught no matter what. God, I'm a killer. I looked around. We were in a small clearing in the woods east from my house, woods that nobody ever went into, which was partly why we did. It was so that we could do whatever we wanted. You know, stupid challenges, games, that sort of thing. Stuff for laughs. But I wasn't laughing, and Josh certainly wasn't either. I looked back down at his body. It was awful. His clothes were torn and tattered, and his face was split open in an awful way, down the left side of his head. You'd have to squint hard if you even wanted to lie to yourself that it looked like remotely human. I felt another pang of adrenaline. I need to be smart. I need to make this go away. I have to. I moved over to my left. There was a ditch here, about 2 meters deep, shallow on one side but rocky on the other. I looked back behind me towards Josh's bike and started to piece a story together. Maybe, I thought, maybe he was riding his bike down here, he got distracted by something. Maybe he went into these sharp rocks. Along the shallow side of the ditch, there was a bit where the rim turned upwards, like a ramp. Okay, he went along here, this ramp, got distracted, hit the rocks. It was the only thing I could think of. Maybe the sharp rocks slit his face like that. It might be a little far-fetched, but it was the best I could think of. I took a deep breath and lifted Josh. He was heavier than I thought, and I almost slipped in the wet dirt as I hoisted him over my shoulder and carefully placed him in the ditch. I tried to make it look like he was crawling away. He probably wouldn't have died straight away. Satisfied with the placement of him, I turned my attention to the bike. It was still pristine, as me and him had just stopped and leant them against a tree earlier on. That's not going to work, I thought. It needs to be bashed up more. I grabbed his bike and slowly rolled it down the mud in the path it would have gone and then lifted it up and threw it across the ditch into the rocks. I picked it back up and did it again. That looks all right. I didn't pick it back up afterwards. It was already in a good spot and probably would be more authentic if I didn't pose it. The last thing I did was take my jacket off with all the blood on it, hoisted it under my arm, put it on the seat of my bike, and after taking one last look back, rode back home. I left Josh there and, with him, a little bit of myself as well. I unlocked the front door of my house and hurried inside. I ran up to my room immediately and hid the coat under my bed. I'll figure out what to do with it later. I dulled my brain with a shooter game, barely paying attention. The rain outside was a small mercy. Maybe it would wash some evidence away. My mum was coming back from work by now, and so I was now trying to act in higher spirits so nothing seemed too off. I guessed I probably had, up until this evening before the police would be called. Josh usually hung around in town for a few hours after we hung out, and so it wasn't unusual for him to be home late. But Josh wouldn't come home. I heard the key turn in the door. It made me jump. I got up and plastered a smile across my face and went to meet her at the front door. "Hello, Dan," she called from the hallway. "Hey, Mum," I said, lingering in the doorway, arms crossed. "Did you have fun with Josh today?" she said, back turned to me, hanging her coat up. Yeah, I did. Had to come home a bit early, though. He said he needed to do something." "Ah, well, I'm sure it was important. Anyway, it's the holidays now. You could always hang out with him tomorrow." "Yeah," I said, my smile slowly fading. When I went to bed that night, every time I closed my eyes I could see that ditch etched into my mind, The mangled roots, the mangled bikes, the mangled body. I got maybe half an hour of sleep before my alarm jolted me awake at 5 a.m. I immediately remembered Josh's face, twisted, warped, impossible. I felt like a stranger in my skin. The air was suffocating. The rooms in my house felt far larger than I'd ever noticed, and that they had any right to be. Large and empty. Nothing felt right. I don't know how to describe it to you because I can't even really understand it myself. But the thought of Josh's parents sat there, worry building, waiting anxiously for a boy who would never come back, their only son, made me feel... I felt sick. I'm not sure if my mom had noticed that something was up. I mean, she must have. But I noticed her giving me weird looks for that entire morning. Occasional glances. All of this pressure kept building and building and building and building to an almost unbearable level until, at about 1 p.m, there was a knock on the door. My mom answered it, and as I sat there in the living room, head in my hands, I could hear what the man at the door was saying. It was muffled, but clear enough for me to hear parts of it. Yes. No. He didn't. His parents haven't seen him. If we could just... Dan, my mom said, opening the door and letting the man into the room. This man here just needs to ask you some questions. It's about Josh. I bottled everything down, swallowed, and then spoke as clearly as I could. Maybe a little bit too quickly, but it was the best I could do. Josh? I looked away from my mom and now at the officer. He had a warm, kind facial expression, but with a tinge of unease and awkwardness. He was about to break the news. I'm not supposed to know yet. What's happened to him? I chuckled slightly. Has he gotten himself into some more... I trailed off. Listen, Dan. Josh hasn't been seen since yesterday morning. Now we've spoken to his mother, and she says that she last saw him when he went out with you. Now if that's true, this means that you might have been the last person to see him. I was staring at the name tag on his uniform. I didn't interpret it as letters, just shapes. I wasn't really focusing on it anyway. He shuffled in his seat slightly. Look, I know it's a lot to handle right now, and I understand that you two were close, but do you think that we could just ask you some questions? I told him that we went up into the woods, although I lied about where exactly. Then I said that after a little while of just chilling out, he'd gone further in, and I'd just turned around and gotten home. All the while, the officer was nodding comfortingly and never once changed facial expression from that slight smile, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. I suppose I was relieved, I guess, that I wasn't being taken in or arrested. In fact, I didn't get any sort of feeling that he even considered me a suspect. And I don't blame him. I don't have a history of anything. I never get into fights at school. I keep my head down. There's not a lot to go on there. And one kid in the woods on his own, anything could have happened. A murder, especially by the kid's best friend, probably wouldn't be high on the list of possibilities. After about half an hour, the officer left, saying he would keep us posted on the search effort, and that was that. Apart from the odd missing poster put up around town, there wasn't really much reminding me of Josh. I'd stopped riding my bike, though. That, at least, was something that reminded me of that scene. But it was getting easier. I got rid of the jacket with all of the blood on it, and although the officers came back to the house a few times, I stuck to the same story, and after a few days they stopped. I felt like I could finally start moving on, at least. And occasionally, I'd pass by the window of Josh's house on the way into town and see his mother sat, head in hands, and she'd give me that comforting smile, the same one that didn't quite reach the eyes, and I'd return it. And deep down, I didn't know if it was worse, that I had done the crime in the first place, or the fact that I was brushing it off so easily. However, this brief comfort ended about a week after the day I'd killed him, because after I'd hidden his mangled body in a ditch and lied to everyone I knew, I got a knock on the door, and as I peered through the window to check who it was, my blood ran cold. Josh was stood outside my front door, grinning. I just sort of stood there, like an idiot. It was him. Of course it was. It was Josh. And somehow his face looked fine. It looked normal. His face was all back in place and his clothes looked fine. He'd noticed me by this point. He waved to grab my attention and with that grin still on his face, eagerly pointed towards the door, mouthing, "Let me in." I didn't know exactly what to think, but I found myself unlocking the front door, and there he was. The person I'd left muddied and bloodied in the woods stood about a meter away from me, clean and healthy. He pushed past me without a word and walked in. "Hey, I thought we were going back out to the woods today." It took me a second to turn around and face him, to process what he'd just said. "Josh, Well, are we gonna go then?" He interrupted, still grinning, but with slight impatience. He pushed back past me into the garden before I even had a chance to say anything and got on his bike that he had left leant against the front of my house. That clean, very much not battered bike. I rode next to him. It wasn't possible. It wasn't. I could still see his mangled face in my mind. It still haunted me. And now, it was all too much. It was supposed to be final. I'd convinced him to avoid the woods. He'd protested, but I was adamant. I didn't want to go back there anytime soon, and I wasn't sure what I'd find there anyway. He was still smiling. It hadn't fallen once since he'd arrived at my house, and it wasn't getting any less unsettling. We were riding now into town. He said we'd go and pick up some food, then sit down somewhere and just hang. I looked back at him again. He slowed to a stop. Look at that." I turned and faced the other way. He was pointing at one of those missing posters that his mother, only a few days ago, had plastered up on every pole or wall around town. "What about it?" My voice, hollowed, managed at least to blurt that out coherently enough. "Well, I don't know. It's weird how everyone thought I was missing for a week, right? Even my mum. It's not like her to forget." I furrowed my brow. Seeing that missing poster at least meant that I wasn't going crazy. But still, I had to be cuckoo somehow. I mean, she even called the police, if you can believe that. I grunted. "But it's okay," he continued. "I told her about what happened and she phoned them, saying it was all right." I noticed I was slowing down, so I caught back up to him as we rode further up our road, past his house. We both slowed as we approached the window. My eyes involuntarily drifted toward it. I looked, and after Josh waving, we both saw his mother grinning and waving back, her head moving between two people. Two people. I stopped suddenly. He stopped too and looked at me in confusion. I tried to think about how to ask this. I didn't want to be too direct, but I still needed to know the truth. "Listen, Josh." I looked at him. He nodded. "What did you mean when you said your mum forgot?" He started chuckling and seemed to relax a bit. "Well, it's the funniest thing." He leaned in closer towards me. "She, somehow, doesn't remember driving me up to the camping spot last Tuesday. Isn't that mad?" I blurted an affirmation. "Tuesday. That was the day after I killed him." I pressed further. Do you remember what happened last Monday?" His grin stopped for a moment and then returned. "Well, come on, of course I remember. You do too, right? In the woods?" He chuckled and started riding again. I joined him, dumbfounded. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, as difficult as that was, and pretended everything was fine. We stopped off at the chip shop, picked some food up, and rode up to the park just as we would do often. It was really odd. It wasn't the fact he was back from the dead that freaked me out. It was the way he was acting. He was like this normally, stupidly positive. And before, that was something that was good. Things were always fun with Josh. But now it was creeping me out. And the fact that he seemed to know what I did to him as well. Does he know I killed him? We sat and ate in silence. I couldn't think of anything to say, and he seemed to be perfectly content eating his chips, so I didn't feel a need to say anything. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "What have you been up to in the last week then, while I was gone?" He paused, smiling. "Camping?" "Camping?" I found myself muttering. "Yeah, of course. I messaged you last week about it. Don't tell me you're forgetting too." His teeth chomped down on another chip. I felt for my phone. I hadn't gotten a text from him. I knew that. I had spent the first few days after I'd killed him constantly rereading our last conversation. I unlocked my phone, Josh still happily eating, and navigated to our messages. I read our last conversation. It was on Sunday. I breathed a sigh of relief. It didn't happen. Josh stopped eating and looked at my phone. He grabbed it out of my hands. "Why are you up here?" he chortled. "Look, you have to scroll down, you knob." He scrolled the chat down and then thrust the phone into my face. I read what it said. Monday, 12:10 p.m. "Josh, oi Dan, listen. I'm going camping tomorrow. Can't remember if I told you or not." I swallowed. I'd never seen that text before. He frowned suddenly and looked back at my phone. "Oh, look," he said. "I didn't scroll far enough." He fumbled with it for a second and then placed it into my hands. He turned away and continued eating. I looked and focused down at the phone. It was the most recent message, on Monday last week at 12:12 p.m. It said, "Mate, why do you never invite me to these things, lol? Anyway, hope you have fun, bro." I chuckled nervously for a split second and then stopped myself. The text is from me. I looked at Josh, keeping eye contact with him while slowly turning my phone off and placing it into my pocket. He wiped his greasy hands on his jeans and smiled. "You gonna eat any of yours?" I hadn't even touched my portion. I looked around the park for a second. The only exit was in front of us, in front of the bench. I looked back at Josh. Yeah, listen." I sprang to my feet and got onto my bike as I started pedaling. I shouted to him, "You can finish them." I turned my attention back to what was in front of me. I knew where I needed to go. I could hear him calling my name, no doubt getting on his bike and chasing after me. But I knew what I needed to do and where I needed to go. But first of all, I had to lose him. As I left the park gates, I immediately turned left into an alley and then turned right. I continued straight ahead for a while before turning out back onto the main road. I was heading towards the woods. I slowed slightly and turned around. I couldn't see him. I didn't know how close he was, but he didn't have line of sight to me, which was something. I gritted my teeth and entered into the woods. I still remembered the route we went through that day. It wasn't a particularly difficult one, as it was mainly a straight line with a hard left turn, and the landmarks along the route were distinct enough for me to remember easily. And when I got there, my suspicions were confirmed. The body and the bike was still there, exactly as I left it. It was rotting now. I gagged and looked away. So what the fuck is the Josh I was just eating chips with? I didn't know what to do. I could point the body out to the police, that would work. An autopsy would say that the body was rotting for a week. That would prove that the Josh that was still alive was some kind of fake, but would they then realize that it was me? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn it in. Don't do that. I turned around. Josh was stood next to his bike, about maybe 10 meters away from me. He wasn't smiling anymore. "How did you... What the fuck are you?" I said, but he didn't answer. "You're not going to tell the police anything," he said. I'll be back up here in a bit to sort all of this out. What are you? I repeated. You let me live my life and I'll let you live yours. We won't talk about this again. His voice was sounding oddly deep and raspy. Remember, it's what you did. I'll see you soon. But before I could respond, he was already far away.